Good evening. Tonight's stories are not grand, not heroic, and not hurried. They are small tales, strange ones, filled with quiet absurdities, gentle foolishness, and moments that seem to drift just beyond reason. You may hear of men who choose idleness over effort, of journeys that go nowhere, of wonders that cannot possibly be true, and yet feel somehow familiar. These stories do not demand your attention. They simply pass, one after another, like thoughts before sleep. There is nothing you need to follow, nothing you need to understand. Just listen as the rhythm repeats, as the world grows quieter, and as your mind begins to drift softly into rest. And now we begin. Strong Hans. There were once a man and a woman who had an only child and lived quite alone in a solitary valley. It came to pass that the mother once went into the wood to gather branches of fir and took with her little Hans, who was just 2 years old. As it was springtime, and the child took pleasure in the many-colored flowers, she went still further onwards with him into the forest. Suddenly, 2 robbers sprang out of the thicket, seized the mother and child, and carried them far away into the black forest, where no one ever came from 1 year's end to another. The poor woman urgently begged the robbers to set her and her child free, but their hearts were made of stone. They would not listen to her prayers and entreaties, and drove her on farther by force. After they had worked their way through bushes and briars for about 2 miles, they came to a rock where there was a door at which the robbers knocked, and it opened at once. They had to go through a long, dark passage, and at last came into a great cavern, which was lighted by a fire which burnt on the hearth. On the wall hung swords, sabers, and other deadly weapons, which gleamed in the light, and in the midst stood a black table, at which 4 other robbers were sitting gambling, and the captain sat at the head of it. As soon as he saw the woman, he came and spoke to her, and told her to be at ease, and have no fear. They would do nothing to hurt her, but she must look after the housekeeping, and if she kept everything in order, she should not fare ill with them. Thereupon, they gave her something to eat, and showed her a bed where she might sleep with her child. The woman stayed many years with the robbers, and Hans grew tall and strong. His mother told him stories and taught him to read an old book of tales about knights which she found in the cave. When Hans was 9 years old, he made himself a strong club out of a branch of fir hid it behind the bed, and then went to his mother and said, "Dear mother, pray tell me, who is my father? I must and will know." His mother was silent and would not tell him that he might not become homesick. Moreover, she knew that the godless robbers would not let him go away, but it almost broke her heart that Hans should not go to his father. In the night, when the robbers came home from their robbing expedition, Hans brought out his club, stood before the captain, and said, "I now wish to know who is my father, and if thou dost not at once tell me, I will strike thee down." Then the captain laughed and gave Hans such a box on the ear that he rolled under the table. Hans got up again, held his tongue, and thought, "I will wait another year, and then try again. Perhaps I shall do better then." When the year was over, he brought out his club again, rubbed the dust off. It looked at it well, and said, "It is a stout, strong club." At night, the robbers came home, drank one jug of wine after another, and their heads began to be heavy. Then Hans brought out his club, placed himself before the captain, and asked him who was his father. But the captain again gave him such a vigorous box on the ear that Hans rolled under the table. But it was not long before he was up again and beat the captain and the robbers so with his club that they could no longer move either their arms or their legs. His mother stood in a corner, full of admiration of his bravery and strength. When Hans had done his work, he went to his mother and said, "Now I have shown myself to be in earnest, but now I must also know who is my father." "Dear Hans," answered the mother, "come, we will go and seek him until we find him." She took from the captain the key to the entrance door, and Hans fetched a great meal sack and packed into it gold and silver and whatsoever else he could find that was beautiful until it was full, and then he took it on his back. They left the cave, but how Hans did open his eyes when he came out of the darkness into daylight and saw the green forest and the flowers and the birds and the morning sun in the sky. He stood there and wondered at everything, just as if he had not been very wise. His mother looked for the way home, and when they had walked for a couple of hours, they got safely into their lonely valley and to their little house. The father was sitting in the doorway. He wept for joy when he recognized his wife and heard that Hans was his son, for he had long regarded them both as dead. But Hans, although he was 12 years old, was a head taller than his father. They went into the little room together, but Hans had scarcely put his sack on the bench by the stove than the whole house began to crack. The bench broke down, and then the floor and the heavy sack fell through into the cellar. "God save us," cried the father. "What's that? Now thou hast broken our little house to pieces. Don't grow any gray hairs about that dear father," answered Hans. "There in that sack is more than is wanting for a new house." The father and Hans at once began to build a new house, to buy cattle and land, and to keep a farm. Hans plowed the fields, and when he followed the plow and pushed it into the ground, the bullocks had scarcely any need to draw. The next spring, Hans said, "Keep all the money and get a walking stick that weighs 100 weight, made for me, that I may go a-traveling." When the wished-for stick was ready, he left his father's house, went forth, and came to a deep, dark forest. There he heard something crunching and cracking, looked round, and saw a fir tree, which was wound round like a rope from the bottom to the top. And when he looked upwards, he saw a great fellow who had laid hold of the tree and was twisting it like a willow wand. "Hullo," cried Hans, "what art thou doing up there?" The fellow replied, "I got some faggots together yesterday, and am twisting a rope for them." "That is what I like," thought Hans. "He has some strength." And he called to him, "Leave that alone and come with me." The fellow came down, and he was taller by a whole head than Hans, and Hans was not little. "Thy name is now Fur Twister," said Hans to him. Thereupon they went further, and heard something knocking and hammering with such force that the ground shook at every stroke. Shortly afterwards, they came to a mighty rock, before which a giant was standing, and striking great pieces of it away with his fist. When Hans asked what he was about, he answered, "At night, when I want to sleep, bears, wolves, and other vermin of that kind come which sniff and snuffle about me, and won't let me rest. So I want to build myself a house and lay myself inside it, so that I may have some peace." "Oh, indeed," thought Hans, "I can make use of this one also," and said to him, "Leave thy house building alone, and go with me. Thou shalt be called Rock Splitter." The man consented, and they all three roamed through the forest, and wherever they went, the wild beasts were terrified and ran away from them. In the evening, they came to an old deserted castle, went up into it, and laid themselves down in the hall to sleep. The next morning, Hans went into the garden. It had run quite wild and was full of thorns and bushes. And as he was thus walking round about, a wild boar rushed at him. He, however, gave it such a blow with his club that it fell directly. He took it on his shoulders and carried it in, and they put it on a spit, roasted it, and enjoyed themselves. Then they arranged that each day in turn, 2 should go out hunting, and 1 should stay at home and cook 9 pounds of meat for each of them. Fur Twister stayed at home. The first, and Hans and Rock Splitter went out hunting. When Fur Twister was busy cooking, a little shriveled-up old mannequin came to him in the castle and asked for some meat. "Be off, sly hypocrite," he answered. "Thou needest no meat." But how astonished Fur Twister was when the little insignificant dwarf sprang up at him and belabored him so with his fists that he could not defend himself, but fell on the ground and gasped for breath. The dwarf did not go away until he had thoroughly vented his anger on him. When the 2 others came home from hunting, Fur Twister said nothing to them of the old mannequin and of the blows which he himself had received, and thought, "When they stay at home, they may just try their chance with the little scrubbing brush." And the mere thought of that gave him pleasure already. The next day, Rock Splitter stayed at home, and he fared just as Fur Twister had done. He was very ill-treated by the dwarf, because he was not willing to give him any meat. When the others came home in the evening, Fur Twister easily saw what he had suffered, but both kept silence and thought, "Hans also must taste some of that soup." Hans, who had to stay at home the next day, did his work in the kitchen as it had to be done. And as he was standing skimming the pan, the dwarf came, and without more ado, demanded a bit of meat. Then Hans thought, "He is a poor wretch. I will give him some of my share, that the others may not run short," and handed him a bit. When the dwarf had devoured it, he again asked for some meat, and good-natured Hans gave it to him, and told him it was a handsome piece, and that he was to be content with it. But the dwarf begged again, for the 3rd time. "Thou art shameless," said Hans, and gave him none. Then the malicious dwarf wanted to spring on him and treat him as he had treated Fur Twister and Rock Splitter, but he had got to the wrong man. Hans, without exerting himself much, gave him a couple of blows, which made him jump down the castle steps. Hans was about to run after him, but fell right over him, for he was so tall. When he rose up again, the dwarf had got the start of him. Hans hurried after him as far as the forest, and saw him slip into a hole in the rock. Hans now went home, but he had marked the spot. When the two others came back, they were surprised that Hans was so well. He told them what had happened, and then they no longer concealed how it had fared with them. Hans laughed and said, "It served you quite right. Why were you so greedy with your meat? It is a disgrace that you who are so big should have let yourselves be beaten by the dwarf." Thereupon they took a basket and a rope, and all three went to the hole in the rock into which the dwarf had slipped, and let Hans and his club down in the basket. When Hans had reached the bottom, he found a door, and when he opened it, a maiden was sitting there, who was lovely as any picture, nay, so beautiful that no words can express it. And by her side sat the dwarf, and grinned at Hans like a sea cat. She, however, was bound with chains, and looked so mournfully at him that Hans felt great pity for her, and thought to himself, "Thou must deliver her out of the power of the wicked dwarf," and gave him such a blow with his club that he fell down dead. Immediately the chains fell from the maiden, and Hans was enraptured with her beauty. She told him she was a king's daughter, whom a savage count had stolen away from her home and imprisoned there among the rocks, because she would have nothing to say to him. The count had, however, set the dwarf as a watchman, and he had made her bear misery and vexation enough. And now Hans placed the maiden in the basket and had her drawn up. The basket came down again, but Hans did not trust his two companions and thought, "They have already shown themselves to be false and told me nothing about the dwarf. Who knows what design they may have against me?" So he put his club in the basket, and it was lucky he did. For when the basket was halfway up, they let it fall again, and if Hans had really been sitting in it, he would have been killed. But now he did not know how he was to work his way out of the depths, and when he turned it over and over in his mind, he found no counsel. "It is indeed sad," said he to himself, "that I have to waste away down here." And as he was thus walking backwards and forwards, he once more came to the little chamber where the maiden had been sitting, and saw that the dwarf had a ring on his finger, which shone and sparkled. Then he drew it off and put it on, and when he turned it round on his finger, he suddenly heard something rustle over his head. He looked up and saw spirits of the air hovering above, who told him he was their master, and asked what his desire might be. Hans was at first struck dumb, but afterwards he said that they were to carry him above again. They obeyed instantly, and it was just as if he had flown up himself. When, however, he was above again, he found no one in sight. Fir Twister and Rock Splitter had hurried away and had taken the beautiful maiden with them. But Hans turned the ring, and the spirits of the air came and told him that the two were on the sea. Hans ran and ran without stopping until he came to the seashore, and there, far, far out on the water, he perceived a little boat in which his faithless comrades were sitting. And in fierce anger, he leapt without thinking what he was doing, club in hand, into the water, and began to swim. But the club, which weighed 100 weight, dragged him deep down until he was all but drowned. Then, in the very nick of time, he turned his ring, and immediately the spirits of the air came and bore him as swift as lightning into the boat. He swung his club and gave his wicked comrades the reward they merited, and threw them into the water. And then he sailed with the beautiful maiden, who had been in the greatest alarm, and whom he delivered for the second time home to her father and mother, and married her, and all rejoiced exceedingly. Layzy Harry. Harry was a lazy fellow, and though his one task in life was as simple as leading his goat to pasture each morning, he grumbled at the thought of it whenever the day's labor was done. He would sit upon the doorstep, rub his weary eyes, and murmur to himself in a voice that scarcely disguised his disgust. A heavy burden indeed to walk a goat to the field day after day, from spring until late autumn. If only I could lie down and sleep for an hour or two, then perhaps the world would seem less grinding. But no, I must keep my eyes open, or the foolish creature will nibble the young saplings, squeeze through a gap in the hedge, and find its way into some rich man's garden, or else run off into the woods and be lost altogether. Where is a man to find rest or peace of his life with such business to mind? He seated himself upon a low stone, folded his hands, and let his thoughts circle round and round like crows in the sky. For a long while, his thinking brought him no comfort. His mind wandered and fell back into the same list of complaints. At last, as sometimes happens when one sits still too long and lets the wind settle in the trees, his eyes seemed to clear as though scales had slipped from them. "I know what I will do," he cried out suddenly, as a man who has found a key at the bottom of his pocket. "I will marry fat Trina, for she too keeps a goat. If her goat and my goat are driven together, the trouble will be doubled for one pair of hands, and thus halved for me. Then I shall be free of this daily burden." With that, Harry rose, set his reluctant legs in motion, and went straight across the lane. For her parents lived no farther than the next house, and asked for the hand of fat Trina. He praised her. In few words, she was diligent, he said, and virtuous, which was true enough so far as laziness admits the existence of virtues in others. Her parents, who liked nothing better than to see plain folk make plain bargains, thought but little, and quickly agreed. Birds of a feather flock together, they observed with a nod, and so the match was made. Fat Trina became Harry's wife, and the two of them began to lead out both goats each morning. Harry found himself with a lighter life and more leisure than before. Now his only toil was the maintenance of his own idleness. He would go out with Trina upon occasion, but only to show that he had been diligent. Then he would say, with a complacent air, "I do this, but that I might afterwards enjoy rest all the more. Otherwise, one loses the taste of it." Trina, for her part, proved no less fond of ease than her husband. She would stretch upon the bed after the goats were fed, and sigh with content, for she had discovered that there are many kinds of work afoot, and many ways to put them off. "Dear Harry," said she one day, as they lay together beneath the eaves after another long morning of little work, "why should we continue to make our lives so toilsome when there is no need? Why spoil the best days of our youth with the bleating of two goats that wake us at dawn? Better it were to give these creatures to our neighbor, who will gladly take them, and in return he will give us a beehive. We shall place the hive in a sunny corner behind the house. Bees, you see, do not require driving to the field, nor watching by the hour. They fly forth on their errands, and always find their way home. And they bring us honey without the bother of leading or coaxing. You speak like a sensible woman, replied Harry, whose thoughts were never cleverer than when they promised him less work. Let us put your notion to deed without delay. Honey tastes sweeter than goat's milk keeps longer, and best of all, it costs us less trouble. The neighbor, who was a man of simple commerce and liked the exchange of beasts for useful things, took the goats and gladly handed over a beehive. The bees began their work at dawn and labored until late twilight. They flew in and out, up and down, and before the year had waned, the hive was full and heavy with the most beautiful honey. In the autumn, when leaves fell and the wind took to sighing through the chimneys, Harry lifted from the hive a whole pitcher filled to the brim with golden sweetness. They placed this pitcher upon a shelf fixed to the wall of their bedchamber, for they feared that some passing hand might be tempted by such treasure, or that mischievous mice would find their way to it. Trina, wary in her sloth, as any sentry, brought an honest hazel stick and set it beside the bed, so that with little movement she might reach out and drive away any uninvited pilferers. Layzy Harry loved nothing more than to linger beneath the feathers until the sun had climbed high. He who rises early, he would say with a yawn, wastes his substance. One morning, while he still lay buried among the pillows in the full light of day, for he regarded noon as early and dawn as an affront, he peered over the quilt and said to his wife with a small voice of envy, "Women are fond of sweet things, and thou art always stealing tastes from the honey when I am absent. It would be better for our store if we exchanged it for a goose with a gosling before thou eatest it all away." "But not so fast," answered Trina, who loved the idea of having something to care for as long as caring cost little else. "How can we tend young geese when we have none to mind them? Am I to rise at all hours and fuss for their sake? I shall not spin my days away on useless tasks." "Think you," Harry retorted, stretching one foot from under the cover, "that a child would mind geese? For us children nowadays do as pleaseth them. They fancy themselves wiser than their elders. Have you not heard of the lad who was sent to fetch the cow and chased 3 blackbirds instead? No, no. I say, wait till we have a child who will do our bidding. Oh, cried Trina, her temper quick as a spark, despite her inclination for ease. If that child will not obey, I will thrash him with more blows than I can count. She seized the stout hazel stick which stood by the bed as if to practice the blow. Full of zeal, she raised her arm to strike the phantom, disobedient one in the air. But mischance, which often attends the schemes of those who would have life made easier by another's task, took a hand. The stick slipped from her fingers, and with a heavy stroke smote the very pitcher upon the shelf above the bed. The pot struck the wall, toppled, and fell to the floor in 1,000 fragments. The rich honey, which had shone like a captured sun, streamed over the floorboards and ran like a small river under the bed. There lie the goose and the little gosling, said Layzy Harry, chuckling at the sweep of fate as though it were a jest brought to his door. They need no looking after. But it is lucky the pitcher did not fall upon my head. He peered at the glitter left among the broken shards. Some of the honey still clung in a piece. With the appetite of a man who finds his comforts increased without labor, he stretched a hand and licked at the remainder. Let us at least enjoy the remnants, he said, with a careless gaiety. After such a fright, we may rest a little longer. What matters if we arise? But an hour later, the day is long enough, I answered Trina, wiping a drop of honey with the corner of her apron and trying to make light of the mishap. We shall come to the end of it in due time. Dost thou remember the snail that was bidden to a wedding and set out with all the best will, but arrived only at the christening? It fell over the garden fence and said, "Speed does no good." And so the 2 who had sought to spare themselves work through bargains and bright ideas found that ease has a way of tripling mischief, and that comfort won by avoidance sometimes loses itself in the very hour it hoped to keep. The 12 idle servants. There were once 12 servants, stout of body, but weak of spirit, who spent the whole of their days in idleness. They never lifted a hand by daylight, and when evening came, instead of mending their faults, they stretched themselves on the grass and made a sport of boasting, which among them was laziest. Each one told his tale of sloth as though it were a badge of honor, and the night grew long with their vainglorious confessions. The first raised his voice and said, "My laziness is greater than all yours, and I will tell you why. The chief business of my life is to tend my own belly. I eat 4 meals every day and drink enough to sink a ship, and after that I must lie still until hunger returns. To rise with the sun is not for me. Rather, I wait until the day is half spent, and then I look about for some soft corner to rest in. If my master calls, I pretend not to hear. If he calls again, I stir myself slowly like a tortoise in winter, and creep to him only when it pleases me. Thus I keep my body whole, and in this fashion I endure life." The second, not to be outdone, spoke thus, "I am set to look after a horse, yet I scarcely trouble myself with his care. I let the bit rest in his mouth, and if I dislike the task, I simply give him no food, saying he has eaten already. Meanwhile, I climb into the oat chest and sleep 4 hours at a stretch. When I awake, I stretch out my foot and brush it once or twice across the horse's back, and that is my combing. Who would make a greater labor of it? Yet even so, the service is too toilsome for me." The third laughed and shook his head. "Work? Why plague oneself with it? One day I laid myself in the sun and fell asleep. A little rain began to fall, but I stirred not. Then the shower came down so hard, it washed the very hair from my head, leaving a bare hole in my skull. Still, I did not rise. At last, I set a plaster upon the wound and thought no more of it. I have suffered many such injuries, but never have they taught me diligence." The fourth folded his hands and said, "When work is given me, I first wander about an hour to save my strength. Then I begin as slowly as if time itself were endless, asking always if no one will lend me aid. If help comes, I let the other do the burden and stand looking on. Yet even standing by is too heavy for me." The fifth, yawning, added his part. "My lot is to clean the horse's stable and load the cart with dung. I take it up little by little, half raising it upon the fork, then resting for 1/4 of an hour before I toss it in. If by day's end I have filled one cart, I count it more than enough. I was not born to kill myself with labor." Then spoke the sixth, half asleep. "You are children compared to me. I fear no work that is true. Yet I lie down 3 weeks at a time without removing my clothes. Shoes may fall from my feet for all I care. When I climb a stair, I drag one foot after the other onto the first step, then stop to count the rest, so I may know where next to rest. Such is my strength, the 7th boasted in a weak voice. My master often looks to see if I labor, though he is gone much of the day. Still, I neglect nothing, nothing save movement itself. I run as swiftly as can be done when one only crawls. To go forward, I need 4 sturdy men to push me with all their might. Once I came where 6 men lay sleeping on a bed. I lay beside them and slumbered too, and when they would wake me, they could not, and were forced to carry me home like a sack of grain. The 8th raised himself a little and said proudly, "Among you, I alone am truly diligent. When a stone lies in my path, I do not trouble to lift my legs. I lay myself upon the ground, though it be wet or muddy, and wait until the swale has dried me. At most, I turn myself a little, that the warmth may strike another side." The 9th said, with a feeble sigh, "That is true. Idleness, indeed. Today bread lay before me, yet I had not the strength to take it, and nearly perished of hunger. A jug of drink was near, but it was large and heavy, and I preferred thirst to the trouble of lifting it. To turn myself round was more than I could endure, so I lay like a log from dawn till dusk. The 10th spoke with a groan. "My laziness has brought me misfortune, for I bear a broken leg and a swollen calf. 3 of us lay in the road, my legs stretched wide. A cart came rolling, and the wheels passed over me. I might have drawn my legs aside, but the midges buzzed about my ears and crept in at my nose and out at my mouth, and I could not take the trouble to drive them away. So now I suffer, yet I still lie idle." The 11th smirked. "I gave up my post but yesterday. I tired of carrying my master's books to and fro without end. He dismissed me at last, for the garments I left lying in the dust became moth-eaten, and he would keep me no longer. Yet I rejoiced at my freedom and counted it good fortune." Finally, the 12th told his tale. "This very day I was to drive the cart into the fields. I spread straw upon it and laid myself down to sleep. The reins slipped from my hand, and while I slumbered, the horse was nearly torn away, the harness stolen, the strap, the collar, the bridle, and bit all carried off by some passer-by. The cart sank into a quagmire and stuck fast. Still, I did not stir. Only when the master himself came and set it free was the thing made right. Had he not come, I would still be there, stretched upon the straw, sleeping in tranquility. And so the 12 servants boasted of their sloth. Each thought himself the laziest, and each was proud of what should have brought him shame. Whether they remained long in their master's service, the tale does not say, but folk whispered that such men are more burdensome than beasts, for even an ox will pull the cart, and a hound will guard the door. But these 12 thought idleness the highest art. The beam. There was once in days, not near our own, a man who called himself wise in secret arts. Some said he had wandered in dark forests, where no birds sing others, that he had drunk of waters hidden under stone, and thereby learned the tongue of shadows. Be that as it may, he clothed himself in mystery, and wherever people gathered, he strode into their midst, carrying with him a staff carved with crooked signs, and a mantle that smelled faintly of smoke and bitter herbs. On one such day, he came into a market square where men and women pressed together, eager to see marvels that their own hands could never accomplish. He lifted his staff, muttered words none could rightly hear, and bade a servant bring forth a cock of burnished feathers. The bird strutted, proudly crowed once, and then behold, beneath its claws, it raised up a beam of wood, as thick as a man's arm, and as long as a wagon. Yet it carried the heavy thing as though it were nothing more than a reed cut from the riverbank. The people gasped and crossed themselves, for they thought it was surely sorcery of the highest kind. Mothers held their children close, farmers rubbed their eyes, and old men shook their heads in wonder. Some whispered, "This man holds power over nature itself. He can make the impossible plain." But among them stood a maiden fair and quiet, who that very morning had bent to gather herbs at the edge of a meadow. There, hidden among the grass, she had found a 4-leaved clover, a plant of such virtue that it grants the finder clear sight into all deceits and phantoms. She held it close in her bodice, and its unseen power brightened her gaze. So while the others marveled, the maiden's eyes pierced through the glamour. She saw that what the cock carried was no beam, no weighty timber, but a common stalk of straw light as dust, and that the magician's murmurings were no more than empty breath. Then she lifted her voice, which was clear as a bell ringing in the morning. "You good people, have you no eyes? Do you not see? The cock bears not a beam of oak, but only a straw, such as the wind might blow across the road." Her words rang out over the square, and in that instant the spell cracked like thin ice. The illusion fell away, and the crowd saw with their own eyes the truth. Murmurs turned to cries of anger, and soon the people pressed upon the enchanter, railing at him for a cheat and deceiver. They seized his mantle, tore it, and drove him out with sticks and curses until he fled in disgrace, his head bent low. Yet as he slunk away, shame burned into fury, and fury hardened into spite. He muttered to himself, "This girl has shamed me before all eyes, but I am not yet undone. My time will come, and she shall rue the hour she spoke against me. I shall have my revenge, though I wait long for it." Time passed. The girl, being wise and good, grew dear to all in her village. At length, a suitor came, and her wedding day was set. The whole countryside rejoiced, for she was beloved, and her betrothal promised gladness. On the appointed morning, she was arrayed in bridal white, with flowers in her hair, and she walked in procession with kinsfolk and friends through the fields toward the little church that stood by the grove of linden trees. The sun shone, and the bells began to ring, when suddenly their way was blocked by a stream swollen with rain. The water rushed swift and deep, and there was neither bridge nor plank. The company halted, unsure how to pass, but the bride, nimble and unafraid, gathered up her garments and stepped lightly down, meaning to wade through as best she could. No sooner had she set her feet in the stream than a mocking voice spoke close beside her ear. "Where are thine eyes, wise maiden, that thou takest this for water?" She turned, and there beside her stood none other than the enchanter, his face twisted in cruel mirth. At his words, the spell fell upon her, and her sight was clouded. She looked again, and lo, she was not in a stream at all, but standing in the midst of a field thick with blue flax flowers. Their blossoms nodded around her like a wave of azure, and her white gown was lifted in vain, for no water ran there. The people behind her saw likewise, and bewilderment turned swiftly into laughter. They pointed and jeered. "See the wise one. See how she hikes her dress as if to cross a brook while she stands only among flowers." The sound of their mocking rolled over her like thunder. Her cheeks burned red, her heart faltered, and she fled away, pursued by ridicule and scorn. Thus, the enchanter's vengeance was fulfilled, though by trickery alone. And so the tale teaches he who unmasks deceit must be steadfast, for deceit will seek to return. Yet truth, though hidden for a season, shall outlast every shadow. The Tale of Cockaigne. In the far-off time of Cockaigne, I myself wandered there, and strange marvels unfolded before my eyes. Marvels so peculiar and tangled with impossibility that to speak of them is to wander in a forest of riddles. I tell you, I saw Rome itself, the great city, and the Lateran Church, not resting upon stone nor earth, but dangling high above, held fast by a single silken thread, finer than a maiden's hair. And there came a man with no feet, who yet outran a horse, as swift as the wind, leaving dust and shadow in his wake. And in his path a sword sharpened, keener than the edge of frost, sliced through an entire bridge, as though it were soft cheese upon a platter. There I beheld a young ass, gentle yet strange, whose nose gleamed of silver, bright as moonlight. This little beast gave chase to 2 hares, nimble as sparks, and together they darted through meadows where wonder bloomed. Close by, a lime tree grew so tall its crown touched the heavens, and upon its branches hung not leaves nor blossoms, but steaming hot cakes dripping with butter, ready to be plucked by any hungry hand. Not far away shuffled an old goat, thin as famine, yet burdened beyond belief, for on his back he bore 100 cartloads of fat and 60 cartloads of salt besides. He staggered, yet did not fall, and I marveled at how his bones did not break beneath such weight. And still I asked myself, had I not already told enough lies? Yet the vision did not end. There I saw a plow plowing the fields without horse or ox to guide it, the earth furrowing itself as though compelled by unseen spirits. And from a village nearby, a child of but 1 year old hurled 4 heavy millstones, stones vast and round, so that they flew from Ratisbon to Treves, from Treves to Strasbourg, faster than a raven's wing. Above, a hawk swam upon the broad Rhine, cutting the waves like a fish, and none dared tell him he had no right to such sport. Soon I heard the fish of the river lift their voices, quarreling so loudly that the sound echoed all the way to heaven's gate. And from a valley hidden in a mountain's crown, sweet honey streamed like a river, flowing as freely as water, gilding the rocks with amber light. Then came still stranger sights. 2 black crows bent their heads and mowed a meadow as though they were reapers of men's fields. 2 gnats, tiny as dust motes, labored to build a bridge of delicate span. 2 white doves fell upon a wolf and tore him to pieces with their gentle beaks. And I swear to you, 2 children brought forth 2 kids as goats would, while 2 frogs together threshed corn upon the ground. I saw 2 mice arrayed in holy vestments, consecrating a bishop with grave solemnity. I saw 2 cats claw a bear's tongue clean out, then a snail crawling swift as lightning struck down 2 lions, fierce and roaring, and left them lifeless upon the ground. By the roadside stood a barber razor in hand, who shaved a woman's beard as if it were the most ordinary of tasks. And 2 babes at the breast scolded their mother, commanding her to hold her tongue. Beyond them, 2 greyhounds strained and dragged a heavy mill out of the river, dripping with moss and water. Beside them stood a weary, ragged horse, and he declared with all his might, "So it is." 4 other horses, stout and strong, stood in the yard threshing corn as men do their hooves, striking in rhythm. And within the kitchen, 2 goats fed the stove with firewood, while a red cow flung loaves of bread into the oven as though she had long kept a baker's trade. At last, a cock upon the fence lifted his head and crowed with all the power in his throat. Cock-a-doodle-doo. His call rang out like the closing of a book, and so the tale was ended. Yet I wonder, do you not see? These are marvels beyond measure, woven of nonsense and wonder alike, where beasts act as men and children speak with wisdom, and all the world dances upside down. Thus I say again, cock-a-doodle-doo. The story is all told, cock-a-doodle-doo. The Shepherd Boy. Once upon a time, in a quiet valley, hemmed in by dark woods and rolling hills, there lived a shepherd boy of no great fortune, but of uncommon wit. His flocks were small, and his clothing plain, yet the people of the neighboring villages spoke his name with a kind of wonder, for no riddle was too twisted for his tongue, and no question too deep for his quick mind. Many came to test him, merchants on their way to distant fairs, millers waiting for their grain to grind, even gray-haired priests passing along the road, and all went away astonished at the boy's clever answers, which were as bright and sharp as frost on a winter morning. Word of this unusual child did not stop at the village boundary. It drifted outward like smoke rising from a chimney until it reached the court of the king himself. The king, who was proud and liked to think no one in his realm was wiser than he, did not believe the stories. A shepherd boy, he said to his counselors, a mere child with bare feet and a crook in his hand. We shall see. And he sent for the boy to be brought before him. So the boy left his flocks and came to the royal palace, which glittered with marble floors and banners bright as the sky after rain. When the king saw him, he leaned forward on his throne, his crown heavy with jewels, and said, I have heard of your fame, little shepherd, but I believe only what I see. If you can give me answers to 3 questions, which I will ask you, I shall take you into my household as my own son, and you shall dwell here in the palace beside me. The Tsar bowed low and said, Your Majesty, what are the 3 questions? Then the king spoke. The first question, tell me, how many drops of water are there in the great ocean? The boy raised his eyes and answered without trembling. My lord king, said he, if you will command that all the rivers and streams of the earth be dammed, so that not a single drop flows into the sea until I have counted them, then I shall tell you exactly how many drops lie hidden in its depths. The king frowned slightly, for he saw the wisdom in the boy's words, and said, Then listen to the second question. Tell me how many stars are shining in the sky. The Tsar asked for a great sheet of clean white paper. When it was brought, he took a fine pen and made on it so many delicate dots, so small they were like dust motes floating in a sunbeam, that no one could count them without losing their sight. The paper shimmered as if it held a piece of the heavens themselves. Then the boy held it up and said, "As many stars are scattered across the sky as there are points upon this paper. Count them if you wish. But no one dare, for the points were beyond all reckoning." The king was silent for a moment, and then he spoke the third question, the deepest of all. "Tell me, how many seconds of time are there in eternity?" The shepherd boy's eyes grew distant, as though he were gazing far beyond the palace walls, and he said softly, "In Lower Pomerania, there stands the Diamond Mountain, which is 2.5 miles high, 2.5 miles wide, and 2.5 miles deep. Every 100 years, a tiny bird comes and sharpens its beak upon the stone. When at last the whole mountain has been worn away to nothing by the touch of that small bird, then the first second of eternity shall be over." At this, the great hall fell still as winter. The courtiers glanced at one another, and then at the king, whose proud face softened. He rose from his throne and placed his hand upon the boy's shoulder. "You have answered my 3 questions, as no man of my court could have done," said he. "From this day forth, you shall live with me in my palace, and I will treat you as my own child." And so the shepherd boy, who had once watched his sheep beneath the open sky, came to dwell within marble halls, yet never lost the clear eyes and wise heart that had carried him from the pastures to the throne room. And many whispered that the kingdom itself grew wiser for having him there. The Three Sluggards. Once upon a time, in a far-off kingdom, girdled by dark forests and silver rivers, there reigned a certain king, whose wisdom and justice were spoken of in every neighboring land. This king had 3 sons, and though each was unlike the other in temperament and look, he loved them with an equal and unwavering heart. Yet as the seasons rolled on, and the snows of many winters settled upon his brow, a great care began to trouble him. He knew that his days upon earth were numbered, and the question of who should bear his crown weighed upon him as heavily as iron. For many nights he lay awake in his high chamber, the moonlight falling pale upon the tapestries and pondered the matter. Each son had been taught the arts of rule. Each knew the laws of the land, the tongues of foreign courts, and the customs of the people. But none shone brighter than the others, and the king's mind, like a compass without a true north, turned now to one, now to another. And so at last, when his strength began to fail, and the hour of his departure drew near, he resolved upon a curious test, a trial not of valor or wisdom, but of something far stranger. On a day when the palace bells tolled softly, and a hush lay over the halls, he summoned his sons to his bedside. The chamber was dim and still, the curtains drawn against the sun, and only the steady ticking of a clock and the faint rustle of the fire could be heard. The three princes came and knelt before their father, their heads bowed, for they saw that the end was close. "My beloved children," said the king, his voice thin but steadfast, "long have I ruled this realm, and long have I wondered which of you should succeed me. You are all dear to me, and none is more cunning or more bold than another. But last night, as the wind rattled the casements, a thought came to me, and it has taken root like a seed. Hear then my decree: whosoever among you proves himself the laziest of all shall inherit the kingdom." At this, the princes looked at one another in astonishment, for never had they heard of such a judgment. Yet the king's eyes glimmered with a kind of quiet mischief, and they knew his word was final. The eldest prince, a tall youth with hair like dark copper, was the first to speak. "Father," he said with solemn pride, "the kingdom is mine by right of your command. For of all men living, none is more idle than I. When I lie upon my bed to rest, and a drop of rain falls upon my eye from the roof above, I will not lift my eyelid to brush it away, but let it fall and fall until sleep takes me. Such is my sloth." The second prince, whose eyes were gray as a winter sea, and whose hands were soft from sitting too long indoors, laughed softly and said, "Nay, brother, the crown belongs to me. For when I sit by the fire to warm my feet, and the sparks leap out and sting my heels, I would rather let the flames burn my flesh than draw my leg an inch away. That is the depth of my idleness." Then the third prince, the youngest, who was pale and quiet, and spoke seldom, but always with weight, lifted his head and said, "Father, and brothers, hear me. If I were to stand upon the gallows with the rope already tight around my neck, and someone were to place a sharp knife into my hand so that I might cut myself free, I would not trouble my arm to rise. I would sooner swing and be done than move my hand to the rope. Such is my indolence. A great silence followed his words. Even the fire seemed to shrink and whisper. The king lay still, his eyes fixed upon the youngest, and for a moment it was as though he gazed through him into some far country. Then at last he nodded slowly, like a man who has heard the end of a long story. My sons, he said, each of you has spoken well, but one among you has carried this matter to its furthest edge. To lie still, though rain fall upon your face, is sloth indeed. To suffer burning rather than stir is greater still. But to accept death itself rather than move a single hand, this surpasses them all. Therefore, the crown shall be thine, my youngest. Upon thy brow it shall rest, and in thine hands, though they be slow, it shall remain. And so it came to pass. The king died, and the youngest son, who was laziest of all, was crowned. And what became of that kingdom under such a ruler, no one can say for certain, for some tales end at the wedding, and some at the coronation, and the rest is left to the telling of others. The Ditmarsh Tale of Wonders. I will tell you something strange, and you must listen carefully, for it is not told every day. I saw 2 roasted fowls, golden and crisp, lift themselves from the platter and take to the air. They beat their wings with haste, though they were already cooked through, and they turned their shining breasts up toward heaven, while their blackened backs pointed down to hell. They flew as if the fire itself had given them new life, and no hunter nor cook could hinder their flight. And as they passed above the river Rhine, I beheld another wonder, an anvil heavy as judgment, and a millstone vast and round floated upon the water. They swam across as if they were swans, gliding prettily, slowly and gently, though their very nature is of iron and stone. The river made no protest, but carried them like feathers upon its surface. Not far from there, where the ice lay still and white, I saw a frog seated as though upon a throne. It was Whitsuntide, the holy festival, and the frog chewed with solemn jaws upon a plowshare, crunching the iron as if it were tender greens from the meadow. Then came 3 fellows with a curious plan, for they wished to catch a hare. One of them was deaf, the second blind, the third dumb, and a fourth could not stir a single step, so that he lay upon the ground as still as a stone. They went out, nevertheless, on crutches and stilts, hobbling and lurching after the creature. Do you wish to know how it was done? I shall tell you. The blind man, who could see nothing, was the first to spy the hare racing across the field. The dumb man, who had no voice, called aloud with such clarity that the lame one heard him. And the lame one, who could scarce move an inch, leapt forward and seized the hare by the neck, as though he had been fleetest of them all. After this marvel, there came certain men who thought to sail where no water lay. They built fine ships with high masts and broad sails, and they spread their canvas wide to the wind. With bold hearts, they launched themselves not upon the sea, but upon the wide, dry fields. The grass bent beneath their keels, and the furrows became their waves. They sailed swiftly over meadow and hedgerow until they came to a mountain, tall and steep. Up its side they sailed, as though it were but another wave, and over the summit they glided, only to be miserably drowned upon the stony ground below, for there was no sea to bear them up. In another place, I saw a crab slow and sideways, chasing a hare that fled with all its speed. And yet, though the hare ran swifter than the wind, the crab was close behind, clattering its claws, certain to seize it. High above, upon the roof of a cottage, stood a cow. She had climbed there by some secret path, and stood gazing down as though she were mistress of the house. She chewed her cud peacefully, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to graze upon shingles instead of meadow grass. And know this also, in that country, the flies are not as they are here, small and buzzing. No, there, the flies grow to the size of goats, with wings that darken the sky and hum like drums of war. When they swarm, a man must open wide his windows, lest the room be filled with their monstrous buzzing, and only then may the great flies fly out into the open air again. So ends the telling of impossible things. Yet who can say what is true and what is false? For in the land of wonders, even the least likely may come to pass, and what the eyes see, the tongue may scarcely believe. The old beggar-woman There was once an old woman, wrinkled and bent, who wandered from village to village with a staff in her hand and a bundle of rags upon her back. Perhaps you have seen such a one before, for there are many who live by begging, and she begged likewise. Wherever she went, she lifted her trembling hand and said in a thin, quavering voice, "A crust of bread, a sip of milk, a kind word, for the love of God." And whenever she received anything at all, no matter how small, she bowed her head low and whispered, "May God reward you 100-fold." Thus she walked on day after day, through mud and dust, through heat and frost. One winter's evening, when the wind howled like a hungry wolf and the snow swept across the road in thick white veils, the poor woman came to a small house at the edge of a village. She leaned wearily on her staff and knocked upon the door, hoping for shelter. Through the chinks of the shutters, she saw a flicker of firelight, warm and golden. Within there stood a boy, lively and sharp-eyed, a mischievous rogue with a kind heart. He had been warming his hands before the blaze, and when he opened the door, the glow fell upon his face. The prince looked upon the old woman, who shivered as though the cold had crept into her very bones. He said cheerfully, "Come inside, old mother, and warm yourself, for no one should stand freezing at another man's door." Grateful, she stepped across the threshold, bowed once more, and went straight toward the hearth. She drew so near that the sparks leapt, and the firelight licked at her ragged clothes. Her garments dry and thin as tinder began to smolder, though she did not notice it, for the warmth was sweet after the bitter cold. Now the boy stood and watched. He saw how the flames curled higher, biting at the edges of her skirt and creeping up the folds of her sleeve. A wiser child might have leapt at once, fetched water, or beat down the fire with his hands. For is it not true indeed, who could deny it, that when another is in peril, even a child must do what is right? If he had no bucket at hand, then let him cry out, or call his father, or fling a blanket upon her. And if all else failed, should he not have wept so fiercely that his very tears might have poured down like two clear streams to quench the hungry fire? But the boy lingered, half amused, half fearful, his feet rooted to the spot. He thought perhaps that the flames would die down of themselves. He thought perhaps that it was not his task to tend to the old beggar-woman. And so the rags blazed brighter, the sparks flew higher, and the peril grew greater with every heartbeat. And here, dear listener, the tale pauses to ask what becomes of kindness if it is only a word and not a deed. For a tongue may speak sweetly, and a door may be opened wide. Yet if the hand does not act when danger is near, the blessing may turn to sorrow, and mercy may burn away like straw in the fire. The Stolen Farthings. Long ago, in a quiet village, there lived a man with his wife and their children. One day, a good and trusted friend came to share a meal at their table. The house was plain, but warm. The wooden boards creaked softly beneath their feet, and the scent of simple fare filled the air. They sat together at dinner, speaking kindly, when the clock struck 12. At that very moment, the door moved of its own accord, and through it stepped a child. Its face was pale as moonlight, its garments white as snow, freshly fallen. The little one neither turned its head nor raised its eyes. Without a word, it crossed the room and vanished into the chamber beyond. In silence, it returned, passed once more through the doorway, and was gone. The next day, when the same hour arrived, the child appeared again. And again, on the third day, always at the stroke of noon, always with the same stillness, always in the same path. At last, the visiting friend, filled with wonder and unease, turned to the father. "Tell me whose fair child is this that slips into yonder room each day at midday?" The father looked astonished. "Child? I have seen no child," he answered, "nor do I know of whom you speak." The friend thought the man was jesting, but when the white figure came once more on the following day, he pointed it out. Yet the father shook his head in confusion, for his eyes saw nothing. The mother, too, and the children at the table beheld no one. Then the friend rose, heart beating fast, and went quietly to the door through which the little one had passed. He pushed it open a crack and peered inside. There on the bare floor sat the pale child. It knelt low, its tiny hands busy digging and searching with anxious care among the narrow crevices between the boards. Its fingers moved as though seeking some hidden treasure. But when it noticed the stranger's gaze, it vanished before his eyes like a mist before the morning sun, the man returned to the table and told the family all he had seen. He spoke of the whiteness of the garments, of the pale cheeks, and of the earnest way the child searched the floor. When he had finished, the mother's face grew sorrowful, and her eyes filled with tears. "Ah," she whispered, "that is my dear child, our little one who left us but a month ago and lies in the grave." The parents then remembered that the child before death had been given 2 farthings. The mother had placed them in the little hand and said, "Give these coins to a poor man, my child, and it will bring you blessing." But the child had been young, and when it saw the coins, it had thought, "I might buy a sweet cake for myself." So it had hidden the farthings secretly beneath the boards of the floor. Because of this, the child had found no rest in the earth. Day after day at noon, its spirit returned, still searching, still troubled by the small wrong it had done. Then the parents, grieving yet gentle, lifted the boards of the floor, and there, just as the friend had said, lay the 2 forgotten coins, darkened with dust. Without delay, they gave the farthings into the hands of a beggar who passed their door, fulfilling at last the gift their child had once been meant to bestow. And from that day forward, when the clock struck 12, no pale child entered the house again. The spirit was at peace, and the family kept the memory of the little one in their hearts, comforted that its soul had found rest at last.